so that we can have this later. And Andrew, if you want to go ahead to the first slide, that would be great. All right, so ground rules will be the same as our meeting last week. I've got everybody on mute for right now to eliminate the background noise. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat. We'll also have a Q&A at the end, so if we don't get to your chat question or if you can't quite figure out how to type it in, you'll have an opportunity to ask that. You can go ahead. Our agenda, we'll do some introductions and background again for anybody that missed last week. We'll go through the technical requirements for this data warehouse that we have developed, and then also talk about the timeline and next steps, and then, like I said, have a Q&A. So for our team, we have DMH, the project manager on that side is Denise Jones. I'm sure you're all familiar with her. And then for the help desk coordinator, we have CG Dixon, and the onboarding coordinator is Bobby King. For FEI, we have a large team. Our product manager is Jessica Knott. The account manager for the state of Mississippi is Kate O'Brien. The project manager is me, Shelby Maloney, and then we have some business analysts, Savi Sani and Ryan White. Our onboarding coordinator on the FEI side is James Brockman. You'll start hearing from him more in the near future. And then our lead developer is who will be talking to you for most of today, and that is Andrew Barden. So I'm going to launch a couple polls real quick to see kind of what the big audience on the call today is. So the first one is, what is your role? If you could answer this for us. We'll leave it open for a little bit. Okay, looks like we got about half of you, almost 60%. I'll leave it open for about 5 more seconds and then share the results. Okay, so you can see we have mostly administrators from our provider organization on the call with us today. And then we also have quite a bit of vendors and some other providers. So now I'm going to launch our second poll, which is, were you on our last webinar? So that was last Wednesday. And this will help us know how much background information we have to give on our next slide. Okay. And for that one, it looks like the majority of you did not attend the webinar on Wednesday, so we'll try and give a little extra background information and go from there. These webinars will be posted on the DMH website, so you will have the opportunity to review them and re-review them.
Hey, Shelby.
Yes.
This is Ryan White from FEI. Hey, I just wanted to mention that at least one person in the chat said that they were on,
Okay.
but they maybe had an issue with the poll, so might not be 100% accurate.
All right.
That's good. So thank you all.
Thanks, Ryan.
Sure.
Right. You can go ahead, Andrew. So for some background information, what we are developing, we are calling the data warehouse. And the reason we are doing this is because DMH has a federal mandate to report TEDS information. to SAMHSA. And so in order to collect that data from not only the WITS EHR, which is the FEI product, we also need to get it from your EHRs. And so to do that is why we are creating that data warehouse so that you can submit your data there and we can have one central location where that TEDS information can be pulled from. All right, you can go ahead. So now we will get into the meat of the presentation. We will do an introduction to the data model, go over that a little bit more, and then we'll also go through the submission guides. We'll talk about validation errors, warnings, and guidance, and then go through the 3 data sets that you all will be responsible for submitting to the data warehouse, and that will be the client data set, the treatment episode data set, and the service event data set. And Andrew, before you get started, I will say we will go even more into detail into our technical assistance webinars. Those start next week and will be bi-weekly. And so this is kind of just peeling back the layers, meeting by meeting. All right, Andrew, you can take it away.
All right, so as Shelby had mentioned, I'm going to take you through, we'll start with the overview of the data model as a whole. And so what you see on this slide here is all of the various data sets that we'll be collecting for DMH. There's 2 on here, the provider and the DMH claim that will be coming from the WITS EHR. And so you don't really need to worry about those, but they're illustrated here just so you can see the relationships between. So these lines here represent data linkages between the data sets, and we'll go over those a little more in the next slide. But all right. This slide here kind of talks a little more about the order and the data link, the dependencies between the data sets. See there, we start with the provider data set. Sort of everything kind of depends on the provider records being there. So before anything else gets processed, we need the providers to be received from the WITS data set, from the WITS EHR. This will be done on a scheduled basis and shouldn't have to worry about that. DMH is responsible for this one. But then the client is next because they point directly to the provider, and then treatment episode and service event. We'll go into the data linkage and what that means a little bit more on the next slide, on future slides. But there is a validation that will look up the provider and make sure that the provider is loaded prior to loading the client data set, and so on with these other 2. All right. So as there are these linkages and dependencies between the data sets, our recommendation, or the system itself will process them in the correct order if they're loaded in as a batch. So during this submission training, which will be at a future date, you'll kind of see how you can submit multiple files at a time, and then the system will process them in their correct order. We recommend that you use this feature rather than trying to make sure you upload the individual data sets in the right order. It'll prevent some data linkage errors in the future. So now we can go into the actual submission guides. And let's see, section 4. All right, so these submission guides cover all the various aspects about the file layout, the business rules, the types of errors you might receive when you submit a file. There's a specific submission guide for each data set, but there's also what we're seeing here, which is the introduction submission guide. This document covers those aspects of the data sets that are common across all the data sets. And we can see here in section 4, it covers that dependencies, those dependencies between the data sets. So section 5 here talks about, didn't take me down. Section 5 here talks about the method and the frequency. Files can be submitted as often as necessary or as often as you can, but DMH will have their own recommendations for when they must be submitted by. And it says here by the 20th of the following month. So this section, as it's labeled, the XML and file naming and file size covers some of our requirements when submitting files. See that the name of the file must start with the data set that it's intended that it contains, which is the client data set or treatment episode data set or service event data set. This has to be the first part of the file name. You can see in the example here. The extension is also important, that they all are XML files. The rest of the naming is somewhat arbitrary. We recommend using dates to help you identify the file for the future. So in our examples, we have the date and time down to the seconds. We also have a limitation that the files are under 50 megabytes in size. If you're generating files that are larger than 50 megabytes, then those will have to be broken up into multiple files. So the schema and validation, we will be releasing XSD schemas for each of the file types, for each of the data sets. We encourage you to validate against these XML schemas prior to submitting the files. If you submit a file that doesn't validate to the XSD schema, you'll get an immediate schema validation error, and you'll have to fix that and resend it. So it would save a little hassle to test that out beforehand. So validation rules and errors.
Hey, Andrew.
Yes.
This is Ryan. Did you want to pause there and just give people a chance to type their questions in, basically?
Sure.
And we can try to field them if they're easy. Otherwise, it might be a good chance for folks to, digest what you were just shown. And then if you have a question on that topic, take a moment and just write it down, and we'll try to get back to it.
All right.
I do see one question coming in. There's a couple coming in, so Shelby, we can try to decide if we can do these on the fly or
Sure. So
yeah.
The documentation is actually already released on the DMH website. Those are posted right now, as well as the link to last week's system overview webinar. We still need to get vocabulary and then the XSD and the XML examples posted on there, but we're starting to work on that. So those should be posted soon.
And I can take the other one if you want, unless you would rather. Sure. And yeah, I see Jim's question for the 837. So it's interesting, Jim, and this is Ryan White again from FEI. Technically, the service event data Andrew's going to show is in the data warehouse XML format. However, and that'll be required to be sent first. And it's essentially just the clinical event, right? It's it'll have the date and like a service code in a nutshell. We'll look at it a little bit more. But then in addition, yes, in order to get paid, there's actually a second part, and you're right, it is a 37 format. Oh, they're saying to speak louder, but that's for you, Shelby. So the service event data actually does go to the warehouse, but then to get paid for it, to get adjudicated, it will actually, the claim will be sent to WITS because that's where the adjudication engine is. So in a sense, that information goes to two places, but it is different. You know, one is saying this, here's a clinical event, and the other is saying, please pay me, right? So that part's not really going to be covered in this call. However, you will see the service event details. And if there's questions on that topic, we can certainly come back. Hopefully that helps.
All right.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't see the chat up, so I guess let me know if
Yeah,
there's any more.
We'll keep an eye on it. I think we're pretty much in good shape.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, feel free to shoot questions in the chat whenever they come up, and we'll get to them when we get to a pause.
Right.
Okay. All right. So I guess moving on to section 8.2 here. We've talked about some of these parts already. There's multiple levels of rules or validations that occur. And the schema validation I went over just a little bit ago. That would cause the entire file not to be processed, and it would have to be corrected before resubmitting. So the field level rules. So we'll see those when we go into the specific data set, submission guides, and I'll show you where to find those field level rules, and then we can, and hopefully those will make sense, and we can answer any questions about those. We won't go over every rule, but we'll go over the different concepts that we have in there. The submission guides for each data set also have this additional business rules section. So these, if there are any on a specific data set, these rules will cover, cross data set or cross column rules that don't necessarily apply to a single column. The data linkage validation rules are those rules that, as I mentioned before, that providers need to be in before clients get in. So when you submit a client, and we'll look at a specific example or two of those in the client data set submission guide, but that's a rule that says one data set's looking for a value from another data set. Errors, warnings, and guidance here. So the important thing here is that each record is processed row by row, or each file is processed row by row. An error on a specific row will not prevent all other rows from making it in. So we'll accept what we can, and then provide the errors on the records that don't make it in, that violate some business rule. Warnings. Warnings are important, but they won't prevent a row from making it into the database, into the data warehouse. But you'll receive guidance from that if a particular row violates a warning. All right, so let's see here. We're gonna go down to tracking changes. So this section kind of talks about the submission actions. This first statement up here is fairly important. Talks about the fact that you can submit, you may have to submit an entire record to create the record in the data warehouse in your XML, but you can submit only changed values to make an update. I can show you a quick example here for a client, that a client file, to create a client, will need to contain all or most of these fields based upon the business rules we'll see But if I'm trying to update just the race and ethnicity after I've already created a client, and your system is tracking changes as to what changed since the last time a file was sent or a client was sent, you could generate an update file that is only those changed values. And you'll see these two fields up here, these source record identifiers. In the client data set, those are the key fields. So that's how we identify the record when you send it again, to determine the difference between a create and an update. We'll use these identifiers to look up the record. And then if we find it, then we can make these updates without having all of the other fields. So we'll look at those and see how that's illustrated in the submission guide as well. We also support a couple other actions. We'll create and update are the default. If you send us a record, we'll do a comparison, see if it already exists. And if it does, we'll update it. If it doesn't, we'll create it. Once again, based on the key fields. But you could also have to delete a record. Say you submitted a record in error. You could send that same record or the same key fields, and we only require key fields for this aspect, with the action of delete. Actually, real quick, I wanted to mention with the update, you can send the entire record again with the same identifiers. You don't have to send just the changed values. We will figure out what's changed and make those corrections. And sorry to jump back to the delete. Yes, with delete, you only need to send the key fields, and then the delete action will tell us that we need to mark this record as delete. It's a soft delete, we'll indicate it as deleted in the system. But if this was an error too, you could even send an undo delete for the same record. Let me pop back to here. So we talk about the delete and undelete actions here. And these sections even go into a little more detail about how they propagate. When you send a delete, you only need to send the delete at the top entity level. If you're trying to delete everything under it, you don't need to send a delete for all of the client identifiers. And so we go back to this XML here, we'll see that there are sub-entities here in the client identifiers. There could be many client identifiers. This looks like a social, and then the physical addresses. There could be many of those as well. But to delete the entire client and all of its identifiers and addresses, you could just send it at this level and say, delete that client and everything underneath of it. And we'll propagate that delete down. The undo delete doesn't operate the exact same way. It can't undo delete everything that's underneath the entity because it doesn't know, that all of those sub-entities were deleted at the same time. So the undo delete would have to be explicitly sent on all of the sub-entities as well. So that's mentioned here in the undo delete section. A child record, right? And you cannot undo, this is saying you cannot undo delete a child record if the parent is deleted. If a parent record is specified be reinstated, all child records will need to be specified as undeleted as well. We might need to make a correction there. All right, moving on. All right. So that whole delete aspect should be pretty rare. It's really just meant for mistakes and shouldn't happen very often. All right, so we were going to pause here as well for any questions. I don't know if any more came up.
There was one, but think Denise answered it
She
correctly.
did.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Denise.
But yeah, Andrew and Shelby, maybe just pause 30 seconds or so. Let people ask if they have questions on key fields. I had maybe one point while they're thinking, Andrew, if that's okay.
Go for it.
That first sentence you showed in section 9, you illustrated it nicely how you showed how they could just send, the updated data. But the sort of the other point of that is, in terms of the records in the file, you also have a choice there. And a recommendation would be, and preference would be, only send me records of things that have had activity. Don't send me your whole database again.
Yes.
Right? You can, and the system will work and it will figure out, oh, nothing changed. But it would be better, and what this is trying to say is, you should have a basic mechanism to, preferably, I'm sure you will, to keep track of, what was the last time I sent an extract, and then have a way to say, grab anything that's, new or updated since then. So that was the other sort of point I wanted to make while people were thinking.
Thank you.
Sure.
It doesn't look like we got any more questions in, so you can go ahead.
All right. So now we move into the specific guide, in this case for client. So we have clients, we have treatment episodes, and service events that we'll go through, and their specific data set submission guides. A lot of the topics between the various entities are going to be the same or very similar. And so I'm not going to go through every field and every rule. We're just trying to cover the description or meaning behind the certain types of rules we see and how to read this document. Each document, each submission guide will have this section that shows you an overview of the entity and its sub-entities. In this case, you have provider-client, you have provider-client physical addresses, and provider-client identifiers. And I've showed you in the XML, and I'll show again, I'm sure, how these are nested underneath the client. So as you have your client identified with its fields that pertain directly to it, under that you'll have the nested section or elements for the physical address and the client and the identifiers as well. So we can come down here to description, really key fields. Another very important part to every submission guide is what are the key fields. So this source record identifier is intended to be the record that identifies this record in your system, so that it is the unique identifier in your system, and you can send that to us, and that along with the provider source record identifier will be unique in our system, and we can use that to look up the record and make updates or find out that or determine that we're receiving a create record and actually insert the row. Additional business rules. So as I mentioned earlier, these are rules that apply to more than one field or more than one entity in a data set. In this case, we're seeing that there are 2 additional business rules on the client. Must have a social security number and must have at least one address. So this is telling us that we're going to receive a validation error if we send a client that does not have a client identifier of type social security number, or we'll receive an error if they do not have at least one address. All right, so we were going to go down. So this section here, this gets into all of the fields that are required to be, or that could be in each data set. that is submitted. So you'll see here the field name, the description. This is the provider's internal system identifier, like how you identify the record in your system. And then data validation, we got data type, so it must be a string or it's going to fail parsing into a string. The max length if it is a string. Errors, so these are business rules. In this case, it's a required field. We always require the key fields. So anytime you see a key field, you'll know it will be a required field. And then some guidance on what that field is, or in this case, we talk about how to generate one if you don't already have one. Just as long as, in the case of a source record identifier, as long as it's consistent and every time you send that client, you send the same source record identifier. We should be able to identify the record and we won't have duplicated records created for them. All right, so we'll go down, we'll see this is another key field, similar structure. It's going to be required. In this case, we can see a linkage validation. So as we talked before, the data sets are required and they have certain dependencies on one another. In this case, client requires that it can find the provider. So when you submit it, this provider source record identifier, this should match what is, I believe, the key from WITS, which is where we're getting this value from. So as WITS is providing, the WITS EHR is providing all the provider data, will be matching on the source record identifier from that system. So birth date, this one is a slightly different data type. We can see, it's a date, so it doesn't have a length necessarily. There's an appendix submission guide that this one uses that talks about the common data types. In this case, date is a common data type, and it explains the types of formats we accept. And generally, it's most formats that you're familiar with. So here are some of the business rules that are defined around this. So it is a required field. It must be less than the current date. This would be the message that you see when the file processes, and if it were to fail for this rule. And then birth date must be between X and Y. And I think right now we have this set to 10 and 100 respectively. So this is another business rule. It's just validating, based upon DMH's requirements, it validates the birth date. So we scroll down, we'll see another string field. There's nothing new there. Keep going, and we'll eventually come down to our first vocabulary field here. So in this case, we store all these codes in a vocabulary system that is a more sort of a robust, code system, and it allows us to maintain and customize the codes that are acceptable for various fields. In this case, we have the gender or the sex code here. There is a specific submission guide that covers the dataset code values, and that will be available as well. So we can go down here and see what the values are available for that particular field. So we have 8300.1, 8300.2, and the unknown value of 2100.4. So I think you may have noticed when I showed the XML that for the code fields, all we have to receive is the actual code value. So we're saying, I believe here that this client is female. All right. We can come down here to, we can see that there's a, there are two, we know from the diagram up top here that there were two sub-entities, and the sub-entities are described in a very similar way. We have key field for sub-entities, and we have the fields all laid out. The difference you might see here is the type code here is a key field for the provider client identifier. Obviously, that's not the record, that's not the value used to identify that identifier and that client identifier in your system. But since it's nested here under the client, our provider client, each one of these will be unique, and we can identify it that way within the client, find the social security number, and update the value if it exists, add the value if it doesn't. But otherwise, you'll see that the fields are all listed in the same way, and you have your vocabulary validation section here that talks about the type. All right, I think we were going to pause here.
Yes, and we have a number of questions. So there were a lot of questions about social security numbers and addresses. Denise answered for the social security numbers. We are modifying that requirement to accept 4 digits versus 9. And then for...
Actually, real quick on that, ahead. Shelby, if I could, Andrew, just scroll down a tiny bit. And there's the reinforcement of what Shelby just said. So yes, social is required, but all it's technically checking is what you see there. It's checking that it's a number and it's either 9 or 4. Obviously, it's supposed to be the real one, but it won't give you an error if you don't have it, as long as you have 4 actual numbers or 9 actual numbers.
And then this question, I think, was also asked in our last webinar. What about the homeless communities we serve? Should we create an address to put them in? I think that was a policy decision that DMH needs to make and will be addressed in the future. And this next one, what happens if we're given an incorrect social security number or we have data entry errors on that? Can these issues be updated since it's a unique ID to client? Ryan, did you want to take that one?
I'll let Andrew take it. I think he knows. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd kind of mentioned that here when I was talking about the example. If you were to have sent a social security number and find out that it's incorrect, you could send a record a lot like this that just has the provider client and the corrected social security number. We saw that the type code here is an identifier for this subentity or key field for the subentity. And as long as we can track down the provider, the client, and then the social security number, we can make that update. But yeah, so they can be updated. Just submit the corrected one and it will get updated.
Nice. There's one more, Shelby, I think, at the bottom.
Yes. And Denise just added a note on that one that you just answered, Andrew, that it won't change your unique client number when correcting a social security number. And that unique client number is coming from your source system. So you set that number when you submit your files.
Hey, real quick, Shelby, on that. Yes. I'm sorry. That comment is more for what Denise said is right on the source record identifier. That is their internal key field, hopefully primary key of their table. That does not have to be the ID that stays the same if the person goes across the state to multiple providers. That's if you scroll down to the end of the fields, Andrew. End of the fields on the provider client level. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were scroll up just a little bit.
Oh, more.
Yeah, that right there. So this field, the unique client identifier, is not that internal key field. This one is the one that, as the red text is saying, they actually don't have to send, WITS will calculate. I'm sorry, I said WITS. Similar to WITS, the data warehouse will calculate based on the demographic information. So the idea being, if the person goes to multiple providers, then this field, you don't send it, but it's in the model, and it gets set the same way no matter where you go. And what Denise was saying was that if you change the social, this thing doesn't get changed. If you change the social changes, this thing doesn't. And this is slightly different than the internal source record identifier for handling inserts and updates. So hopefully that's clear. If it wasn't, you can listen to it again on the recording.
And then a follow-up question on this topic. So if we were to get a client that is unable to communicate to us their social, we could in theory put a temporary social until we were able to get the correct information and then adjust it in the warehouse. So, and that, you wouldn't be adjusting it in the warehouse, you would be adjusting it either in your system and then resubmitting an XML file with that corrected information.
Yep, and Denise answered that, confirmed that.
And then this last question says, we do not collect sexual orientation information. What would we send in that field? And so that one is a optional field. If you want to scroll to that.
Yeah, I was trying to get. Okay.
Okay. You can answer this one, James, if you want.
So yeah, I was just going to say, this is James Brockman from FEI, by the way, that this is an optional field, and if you don't collect it, you don't have to send it. And I also wanted to point out that all of the fields will either say they are required, and you'll have an error that, you know, you haven't sent this and it's required. They're required under certain circumstances, and you'll get an error if those circumstances are met and you didn't send it, or they'll explicitly say under guidance that they're optional. So you will know for every field if they are required, when they're required, and if they're not required, that they are optional.
All right. I think we got all the questions, so you can move on, Andrew. Thank you. Thanks, James.
Very good. All right. So we finished up there with the client submission guide, and now we can move on to the treatment episode. All right. So here's the treatment episode diagram. It's a bit more complicated than client, but it's collecting a lot more data. Once again, we start off with a overview, a diagram of it. We can go down and see what the key fields are. Once again, it's got a source record identifier. That's a common concept. Send us a record to identify this, or a value to identify this record in the future. It's going to have, so we have some additional business rules. One important thing as we go into the sub-entities, I guess when we get to the admission, we'll talk about, or maybe we can skip down there and talk about the fact that this treatment episode is really, it supports mental health and SUD. So there's a field on the admission that is important to that concept. The program area code will tell us program area code will tell us whether the client is being admitted for mental health or substance use disorder. There's some other concepts in the treatment episode that are different from the client, and those concepts are associations and one-to-one repeating subentities versus repeating subentities. So in the treatment episode, we have the performance outcome measures, and there could be many of those submitted for an admission. But an admission and a discharge could share a performance outcome measure as well. So in this example here, we can see that if we search out the source record identifier here, we'll find that this performance outcome measure here, there's a lot of fields here. It's a lot of data. Rather than being sent and repeated for each admission or discharge that shares it, we can associate the performance outcome measure, send the performance outcome measure once, or we can receive it once, and we can associate it with each discharge or admission that uses that performance outcome measure. So in this case, we can see that the actual performance outcome measures are outside of the admissions, but there is a performance outcome measure under the discharge here that just references it. So in our system, or in the data warehouse, it'll create a reference to that performance outcome measure. Performance outcome measure also illustrates another point, or another concept that we have, which is that some sub-entities have a one-to-one relationship with their parent. In this case, we can see the performance outcome measure is broken up into many different sections, but each of those sections, most of those sections, can only appear once on a performance outcome measure. So the financial and household section can only appear once for each performance outcome measure. The used substances, however, can repeat. We can have multiple used substances, and we can see this by the element here, the container element having a plural value, or a plural used substances, and then each used substance underneath. So that's how we kind of design the XML to utilize the hierarchical structure of XML to prevent having to, I guess in the prevent having to repeat the entire performance outcome measure and just associate it, but also kind of organize the performance outcome measure into its different sections.
Andrew, can I just chime in real quick?
Sure.
It was good. And if you want to point them back to the definition section of the submission guide and the previous recording, once that's posted, there's a little bit more background discussion given on just the words, admission, episode, outcome measure, discharge. So in the guide, there's that definition section, if you want to show that real fast. So up in the, or not there, but in the treatment episode.
Like treatment episode guide.
Right. So the DMH has written some basic descriptions there for each thing, and they're sort of further explained as you go in the descriptions, but it was also talked about on the previous call. So if you go back and listen to that, there's a little bit more there. And as Andrew said, I guess just to stress it, that for those of you who are submitting currently to the CDR, I think it's the A file is the substance abuse. So those would be basically each record there would sort of equate to an admission with a substance use program area. And I believe it was now I forget. I think it was the D file for mental health. So those would be sort of equivalent to admissions with a program area mental health. And so what was talked about was this is sort of the consolidation of all of that so that they could kind of see the whole picture and report all of it to the federal government, not the names, but what they need to report to the federal government for this TEDS reporting that really drives funding and all kinds of things. So it's a flexible model, and tries to put everything in one place to cut down on the number of files you have to send. And then I think you're going to talk a little bit about the how some things are conditional. But maybe before we do that, the other point that Andrew said was he showed how a performance outcome measure could be shared, and he also said that you can send many. However, nothing currently requires you to send many. This is a flexible model that encourages and allows you to send many outcome measures over time. Say for a mental health person who's in treatment a long time, you send the first measurement tied to your mental health admission, right? But what about 60 days later, or 90 days later? Whatever sort of the policy is, the system allows for you to send another sort of measurement of all of those data points. So that's why it's separated. Whereas in the past, everything was sort of flat on that A file or on that D file, and you only had one chance to send it. This model is sort of taking a step toward the future of over time, growing into, well, let me see those values a little more further down the line. So that's why there's a outcome measure entity in general, and that's where most of the data is. So that was talked about a little bit before, and I just wanted to sort of chime in with that. And yeah, so thanks.
Great points. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And IDD, sorry, and Denise's, thanks to Denise. Sorry, real quick. And the, what was it, Denise? The I file, was IDD. Those will technically be admission rows where the program area is mental health, and they will follow the same rules as the mental health data. So there may be follow-up questions to that, but that's kind of the design. There's only two program areas, substance use and mental health. I know that WITS uses a modality to differentiate the IDD data. There will be a similar way to differentiate the IDD data in that he's actually showing it on the top of the screen in the admission mental health entity. There's a treatment setting that he'll probably go into, but this isn't WITS, so this is the warehouse, and IDD is considered mental health, but has a special sort of setting code. So hopefully that covers it, and I'll let Andrew show some of those conditional things.
Yeah, I think we were gonna show the conditional, I think here in the use substances under the performance outcome measure. Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, so if you can do,
is that the?
Yeah, go up to like admission. And
open the admissions part, sorry.
Yeah, show them how those two are mutually exclusive, and then maybe the POM additional, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so the admission use or substance use and mental health, right. So these two sections,
you can see it in the additional business rules.
Yeah, above. That's where it was going. That's where we wanted to go, sorry about that. All right. So, okay, the admission substance use entity is required if, right, so the admission substance use entity is required if the substance use program rule, so this is the rule that requires a admission substance use entity based on the admissions program area code. And then there's also a rule requiring an admission mental health entity if the admissions program area is mental health services. So dependent on the admissions program area, one of these two sections is required.
Right.
I believe you were saying that they're mutually exclusive.
Well, intended to be. I'm not sure that that's enforced, but the key point being, if it's substance use, we need to know the care level. Right. And if it's mental health, the setting.
Right. Okay. And we could go down here and see the fields in the substance use and the admission substance use section would contain the level of care. And then down here, we would collect the, sorry, there you go. Oh wait, no, you're right. I was off by one. Thank you for that. All right. So
you're
down
clicking
here
in
in
and
the
scrolling. You're clicking and then scrolling down. You click
yeah,
there you go.
yeah. So sorry about that, guys. All right. In the admission mental health section, we collect the treatment setting code. I think that's all I needed to cover for the treatment episode.
Maybe show them the one
anything
more.
Else?
Show them the one more on the POM with the POM additional rules. How some of that data, like the substance that you were talking about, POM additional
down
so
in the POM section. There you go. Sorry, I'm not following.
Yeah, that second one there is the one we're going to talk about.
Okay. Oh, so at least one use substance disorder is required. Yeah. So at least one use substance with non-blank disorder rank number is required if the related admissions program area code equals the substance use disorder treatment, right? And we could see here in our example that we that's referring to this section here. Then the use substance, at least one of these is required when the admission that it's associated with has a program area code of substance use disorder treatment. All right.
Yeah, so maybe just let the questions come in now.
Yeah.
I'll go back on mute.
Okay. All the questions that have been asked in here so far have been answered. So we'll give a couple more seconds to see if any more come in, and then we can continue on.
Did someone answer the one from Donna?
Oh.
About we don't collect substance use information, so we would not be required to send that section, right?
I don't think we did.
Okay. I would punt that to DMH, but I would assume the answer is yes. You don't have to send it. Substance use admissions if you don't do that work. But if DMH wants to chime in.
So Denise responded, she said IDD will be mental health and not substance use.
There you go.
Cool.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Our last submission guide here is the service event, and the service event is actually fairly small data set. We can see here in the diagram it's only got the one service event entity, but the structure is going to be the same as you go through the submission guide with the key fields and then the various field descriptions. Sorry. I don't think there's any new concepts to introduce here. We do have a couple linkage validations, right? We need, there's a linkage validation to the episode source record identifier. So the program treatment episode, there's a linkage validation to the admission source record identifier. So both of those have to exist before the service event will be accepted. I have an example here, a very small example of a service event. This one's pretty straightforward and very flat. No sub-entities here in the service event. So, oh, I went back to, so I guess, kind of covered, we did talk about the 837 earlier. I think Ryan handled a question about that. This is the service event. The 837 will be sent to WITS and processed there.
Right, so this one doesn't have any money associated with it. It's just the clinical event. And then, I think you may even, in order to get paid, you might even send multiple 837 attempts on a single service. It might get denied at first and then eventually paid. So there's a difference in theory between the service event and the claims that it took to pay that service event. So yeah, we can talk more about that if needed. I think there's another question. Looks like it was answered, Shelby. I don't know if you want to repeat it. About logins.
Oops, I was on mute. There was a question, when do we get test logins for the data warehouse? So we have a training scheduled for the 19th, and they will be sent out after we do that training.
Cool. So Andrew, do you have the portal? Just preview that. Do you have that slide or no?
There's a slide for it in there in the PowerPoint. We've got to
go back in the presentation here.
There we go.
Oh, I think we have the vocabulary example first. We went into the document here and showed that all of these different code sets are defined in the vocabulary submission guide. Is it beyond here?
There's another question coming in. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. So maybe before you do that, it looks like another question coming in from Jim about services. Andrew, so you don't see the chat?
I don't at the moment. No.
Okay.
Perhaps I can bring it up though.
Shelby, you want to read it?
I can read it. It says, are these services here consolidated? I didn't see anything identifying the client who received the service. If so, maybe these are consolidated by service type.
I don't see anything identifying the client. Okay, yeah, I can speak to that. So in the key fields, actually, this one's handled in the linkage validation, right? So there's a couple linkage validations here for the service. The treatment episode, as I explained, and the admission as well. Treatment episode has a client associated with it. So when you associate the service event with a treatment episode, we know the client at that point. So as long as we have a treatment episode with that client on it, then we can make that association and it'll pass this linkage validation and we can associate those two.
Maybe show the picture real quick, reinforce that.
Right. That's in the presentation?
Yeah. I guess that's not the running one. Yeah.
Oh yeah. But to go back a couple?
Yeah, back a couple. Yeah, there you go.
Right. And so these lines here, we have service event. We can see that has a linkage validation to the treatment episode and then the treatment episode to the provider client. So that's how the association is performed between the service event and the client. Hopefully that covers that question.
Yeah, I think Jim said thanks.
All right.
It must have made sense.
Okay, so for the UAT, we had that question about getting accounts set up and logins. So we have that training next week, the 19th, I'm sorry, 2 weeks from now, the 19th at 10 a.m. Central. And that will be a formal training on how to submit the XML files to the data warehouse. And so there was also a quick submission example that was provided in the system overview webinar last week, that is posted to DMH's website, and it's linked there if you want to re-review that. But the next slide, Andrew, that's just a screenshot of what the portal will look like when you log in. It'll take you directly to this back screen, and then when you click upload, the front screen will pop up, and that's where you will upload your files. Seth asked, will you be able to submit using SFTP?
So Denise may want to jump in here. I think the decision was not initially.
Yeah,
right.
She said not at this time.
Right.
And we got another question, how do we have access to the portal? So our providers will be given login credentials to the portal after that training on the 19th. And then they will be able to test their submissions there. Okay, we can. Okay, before I go into this, we have another question from Seth, and he says, so will submission be able to be automated in any way, or will it have to be run through a user interface? Right now, it is through that user interface.
Shelby, maybe it's a good time to, you probably have it at the end, but I think there's an email address where questions like that could be escalated if need be. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so for our rollout plan, we did our kickoff webinar back in November and the system overview last week. We are doing the technical webinar now. Next week, we'll start our bi-weekly technical assistance webinars. Those will be for both providers and vendors, and you should have gotten the invites to that. The first three at least will be a deeper look into the submission guide. So we'll go through those and you can ask your questions more in detail. And then I've mentioned this a couple times, but the webinar training for the admin portal and XML data, that will be for providers only, and that one is on the 19th. Here it says you'll receive your credentials prior to training. That will actually happen after training. And so here is the rollout plan for configuration and testing. We will send out the XML schema definitions and some XML examples. Those will also be posted to the DMH website. So once you have those, you can begin your XML schema testing. Our submitting entities, so our providers, can start testing their UAT submissions. And then as you do that, Mississippi DMH will validate those data set testings. Our green light to go will be August 1st. So that's when you will start submitting your real data, and that will be using July's data. I have one more poll in here. And it is, will you have the ability to test the upload process using false patient data? So using UAT data with no PII or PHI. Okay, we've got about 18% of you who have written in. I'll leave it open for a couple more minutes. Not minutes, I'm sorry, seconds. Okay, we didn't get a whole lot of responses for this one, but it looks like the majority of you will be able to test with fake data, but there's a number of you who won't. So we will keep that in mind. And then just this note that we're leaving on here, if your EHR is not ready to submit to the data warehouse by July 31st, you will have to enter that data into WITS until your system is ready. Okay. So for our next steps, we have the data warehouse homepage. So there's the link to this. I will also email out a PDF version of this presentation. And so the webinars and support documentation will be posted to that website, and will also include XML schema definitions and examples for providers and vendors to attend applicable webinars. And so that means the technical assistance webinars that start next week, and then also the submission upload training. Vendors are going to start configuring systems to generate the XML files to upload. And then there was a survey sent out on the 21st of January from DMH. If you have not completed that, please do.
Looks like a question in there. Might be a good time to talk about. Someone asked, we would prefer to use actual client data. Is it secure?
So we were deciding whether we were going to have you test in our production environment or our UAT environment. I think because of the number of people who won't have the ability to use the fake client data, we'll have to do it in our production environment, which means that, yes, it is very secure. And can we have this presentation deck? Yes, I will email it out after this call. And then there was another question about the survey, which Denise answered in the chat. All right, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so here's the time for questions. If you have one you would like to ask out loud and not in the chat box, feel free to unmute yourself and ask that now. If not, you can send that to ehrhelpdesk@dmh.ms.gov. Okay. You can also still put questions in the chat if you have them.
Hey, Shelby, this is Denise.
Hey, Denise.
I put in a comment just then. If you're sending emails to ehrhelpdesk@dmh.ms.gov, please put WITS, W-I-T-S, in the subject line of the email. I've got a business rule that'll take that and get it to the right group. We're using that help desk system for multiple EHR systems, and we don't want your email to get lost.
Great. Thank you, Denise. Okay. Are there any more questions? Seth is asking if there are any providers using Methasoft on the call. So if there are, you guys can respond in that chat box. So we already have one yes.
Hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. So if anyone on this, like, let's see, who was that? Michael. Yeah. If you could email me your address, I would like to know who you are, and I'm sure you're not the only ones. In other words, there are probably some not on the call that I need to reach out to, but my email is sspearman@methasoft.com. So, Michael, if you would not mind emailing me, just so I have your contact info, that'd be great. And anyone else that is using Methasoft.
All right. Are there any more questions? Okay, well, thank you all for your time. If you think of anything between now and then, feel free to email that Mississippi email address, and I will send out a email with this slide deck.
Shelby, there might be one more.
Oh, I do see one more. If we already use automated upload process for CDR, can we use an automated process in the test system? Not at this time. It will be the portal submission. All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day.